Adrian Hale, a millionaire tech mogul, thought his beautiful, compliant wife would never defy him, until she vanished with $12 million. "I didn't disappear," Mara said. "I escaped." What happened next left him shattered. Trapped in a gilded cage, Mara endured betrayal and control, until one night a single keystroke turned the tables. But when the dust settled, the past came knocking. Could a broken man truly change? Before we begin, take a moment and comment your city below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Now let's dive in. The silence in their San Francisco penthouse was a specific kind of silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, weighted silence of unspoken words, of rooms too large for two people who had forgotten how to fill them. Mara felt it most in the evenings, after the city lights had begun to glitter across the bay, turning their floor-to-ceiling windows into a living mural of unattainable beauty. The view, like everything else in her life with Adrian, was exquisite, expensive, and felt like it belonged to someone else. Tonight, the silence was particularly loud. Adrian was late again. A bored dinner, his text had read, sent 3 hours earlier. No kiss emoji, no love you. Just the sterile efficiency that had come to define their communication. Mara ran a hand over her belly, still flat but holding the most profound secret of her life. She was 6 weeks pregnant. A tiny, fluttering hope she hadn't yet shared, waiting for a moment that felt less like an interruption and more like a celebration. She was beginning to fear that moment would never come. Their life, from the outside, was an enviable tapestry woven with threads of gold. Adrian Hale was a titan of the tech industry, a self-made millionaire whose ambition was as vast as the ocean their penthouse overlooked. He had swept Mara off her feet 5 years ago. She was a budding art curator, full of passion for color and form. He was a whirlwind of charisma and power, promising her a world where she would never have to worry about anything again. He had kept that promise, but in doing so, he had systematically dismantled the world that was uniquely hers. Her gallery job was the first to go. "Why work, my love?" he'd murmured, his voice a velvet trap. "Your eye is too good for that little place. We'll build our own collection." The collection now adorned their walls. Warhols and Basquiat stared blankly into the silent rooms, their vibrant energy muted by the sterile opulence. They were his choices, his investments. Her opinions were welcomed, then gently dismissed. Her friends, artists and dreamers who lived on passion and cheap wine, slowly faded from their life. They didn't fit in with Adrian's circle of venture capitalists and their polished, brittle wives. Mara had become another of his acquisitions, beautiful, well-maintained, and utterly dependent. The seed of suspicion had been planted months ago, a tiny, bitter thing. It started with the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirt, a scent he'd brushed off as someone at the office. It grew with the late nights that became more frequent, the hushed phone calls he'd take on the balcony, his back turned to her. He'd become a fortress, his phone and laptop guarded by passwords he no longer shared. "For security, Mara," he'd said, a touch of impatience in his tone. "You understand?" She did. She understood that she was the one being locked out. Tonight, the suspicion had bloomed into a sickening certainty. Earlier, searching for an aspirin in his gym bag, her fingers had brushed against a small, velvet box. Not a ring box, but something flatter. Her heart had hammered against her ribs as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a delicate gold necklace with a single, perfect sapphire. It wasn't for her. Her birthday had passed 2 months ago, And their anniversary wasn't for another 4. It was an intimate gift, the kind a man gives a woman he is trying to impress, to possess. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place an hour ago. Adrian had an iPad, an older model he kept on his bedside table for reading news. It was the one device he hadn't bothered to update with his new, secret passwords. It was linked to his iCloud account. With trembling hands, Mara had opened his messages. And there it was, a thread of texts, not with a man's name, but with a single red heart emoji. The messages were a tapestry of their own, woven with stolen moments, inside jokes, and explicit plans. "Can't wait to have you all to myself tonight," the last message from the red heart read, sent just after Adrian's text about the bored dinner. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. The name was Aria Torres. The pictures exchanged were of a woman much younger than Mara, with the kind of fierce, hungry beauty that Mara felt had long since been polished away from her own reflection. There were photos of them together. On a boat, at a winery, in a hotel room that was definitely not in San Francisco. The sapphire necklace was clasped around Aria's neck in one of them, her head thrown back in laughter, her hand resting possessively on Adrian's chest. A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, washed over Mara. It was more than the morning sickness she'd been hiding. It was the physical manifestation of betrayal. The life she had, the man she loved, the future she was carrying inside her. It was all a lie. The gilded cage she had slowly, willingly walked into had slammed shut, and she was trapped. She sank onto the cold leather of their designer sofa, the iPad falling from her numb fingers. The silence of the penthouse was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the ghost of her marriage, the spectre of her naivety. She looked at the city lights, the millions of lives flickering in the distance, and felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. But as the tears subsided, replaced by a cold, clear emptiness, a new feeling began to stir. It was faint, a tiny ember in the ashes of her heart. It was anger, and it was the first thing that had felt truly her own in a very long time. The man she had married was a stranger. The life she was living was a sham, and the woman who had let it happen was about to disappear. Adrian Hale adjusted his tie in the reflection of the elevator's polished brass doors. He liked the man who looked back at him, sharp, confident, a predator in a bespoke suit. The world was a game, and Adrian had learned early on how to win. He thrived on the art of the deal, the thrill of the acquisition, whether it was a struggling startup or a piece of rare art, or a woman. He stepped out into the lobby of the St. Regis, the scent of money and ambition thick in the air. He wasn't at a board dinner. He was meeting Aria. The thought of her sent a familiar jolt of adrenaline through him, a potent cocktail of desire and risk. Aria was everything Mara was not. She was fire to Mara's cool water. A 26-year-old marketing executive at a rival firm, she was sharp, audacious, and unapologetically ambitious. She didn't just admire his power, she mirrored it. Their affair had started 6 months ago at a tech conference in Austin. It began with a debate over market strategy that turned into a flirtatious dinner, which bled into a night that left him feeling invigorated in a way he hadn't in years. With Mara, life had become comfortable, predictable. She was beautiful, graceful, the perfect hostess. She was the calm harbor to his storm, and for a time that was what he wanted. He loved her, or at least he loved the idea of her. He loved the home she made, the way she looked on his arm at galas, the quiet adoration in her eyes. But comfort had a way of becoming boring. Her gentle nature, which he once found soothing, now felt like a lack of passion. Her contentment with the life he provided felt like a lack of drive. He had built a perfect world, and now he was suffocating in it. Arya was his escape. She didn't want to be protected. She wanted to be challenged. She saw him not as a provider, but as a peer, an equal in the game. Their conversations were battlegrounds of wit and intellect, their nights a clash of raw, uninhibited passion. She made him feel young, vital, like the man he was before the millions and the responsibilities, the hungry wolf, not the well-fed lion. He spotted her at the bar, a slash of crimson dress against the dark wood. She turned as if sensing his presence, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. It was a smile that said, "I know what you want, and I have it." "You're late," she purred as he slid onto the stool beside her, her knee brushing against his. "Closing a deal," he lied smoothly, the excuse falling from his lips as easily as a breath. He signaled the bartender. "The usual. Always closing," she murmured, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "I hope it was worth it." "It was," he said, his eyes holding hers. "But this is better." The lie didn't even register as a lie anymore. His life was a series of compartments, each sealed off from the other. There was Adrian, the CEO, Adrian, the husband, and Adrian, the lover. He moved between them with a practiced ease, convinced he had mastered the art of the divided life. He told himself it was what men like him did. They were entitled to more because they achieved more. It was a form of compensation for the immense pressure he was under. He paid for Arya's apartment in the Mission District, a sleek, modern space that was their sanctuary. He'd filled it with things he knew she'd like, edgy contemporary art that was the antithesis of the classic pieces in his penthouse. It was another layer of the deception, another world built just for him. He justified the expense, the lies, the sheer, calculated betrayal with a simple, powerful mantra. "I deserve this." The guilt, when it came, was a fleeting shadow, easily banished by the bright light of his own ego. Sometimes, late at night, lying next to Arya's warm, sleeping body, he would think of Mara. He would picture her in their vast, quiet home, probably asleep, her face serene and trusting. A flicker of something, pity, remorse, would stir in his chest. He would remember the woman he'd fallen in love with, the passionate art curator with paint on her fingers and dreams in her eyes. He had promised to protect her from the world, but he had become the very thing she needed protection from. He would quickly push the thought away. He was providing for her. She had a life of unimaginable luxury. What she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. It was a victimless crime, a necessary indulgence. He was giving her everything she could ever want. It was only fair he take something for himself. This logic was his shield, deflecting any arrow of conscience that dared to fly his way. "I have something for you," he said, pulling the velvet box from his pocket. Arya's eyes lit up, a genuine, almost childlike delight that he found intoxicating. She opened it, and her breath hitched. "Adrian, it's beautiful." He fastened the sapphire necklace around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. The stone was a perfect match for the blue in her eyes. "It's for my best girl," he whispered, the words a poison dart aimed at a woman miles away, sleeping in a bed that had grown cold. He was an architect, a master builder of a life constructed on a foundation of lies. He admired his own creation, the intricate design, the flawless execution. He never once considered that the entire structure, so carefully built, could be brought down by a single, silent tremor of discovery. He never imagined that the quiet woman in his gilded cage had a strength he had never bothered to look for, a will he had fatally underestimated. He saw her as a beautiful object to be possessed, forgetting that even the most fragile-looking things, when pushed too far, can shatter their confines with explosive force. The sun rose over the bay, casting long, accusatory shadows across the marble floors of the penthouse. Mara hadn't slept. She had sat on the sofa all night, the cold leather seeping into her bones, watching the city awaken. Each passing car, each distant siren, was a sound from a world she no longer belonged to. She was adrift, in a state of shock so profound it felt like a dream. But the iPad on the coffee table was a brutal anchor to reality. When she heard Adrian's key in the door around 2 a.m., she had fled to their bedroom, feigning sleep. She couldn't face him. Not yet. The man who had slipped into bed beside her, smelling faintly of wine and a foreign perfume, was a stranger. She had lain there, rigid, her back to him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. The sound that once soothed her now felt like a taunt. How could he sleep so soundly, so peacefully, in the ruins of their life? Now, in the stark light of morning, the shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a tide of raw, agonizing pain. It was a physical ache, a hollowness in her chest so vast she felt it might swallow her whole. Every memory of their life together was now tainted, every "I love you" a lie, every shared smile a performance. She was the star of a tragedy and hadn't even known she was on stage. And then there was the baby, her secret, her tiny, fluttering hope. The hope that this child would be the glue that mended the cracks in their marriage, that it would bring Adrian back to her, back home. The irony was a bitter pill. This child, conceived in a marriage that was already a lie, would now be born into a war zone. The thought of bringing a baby into this world of deceit, of raising a child with a man who was a master of deception, was unbearable. A new wave of nausea washed over her, and she ran to the bathroom, retching into the toilet. As she knelt on the cold tile, gasping for breath, something shifted. The pain was still there, a roaring fire in her soul, but beneath it, a new layer was forming. It was hard and cold and clear. It was resolve. She would not be the victim in this story. She would not be the weeping wife, the pathetic, discarded woman. Adrian had built his empire on lies, and he had used her as a beautiful, passive decoration in it. He had underestimated her, seen her as property, an asset. He was about to learn how wrong he was. She stood up, her reflection in the vast mirror, a pale, haunted version of herself. But her eyes, though red-rimmed and shadowed, held a new light. A dangerous light. She was not just Mara Hale, the millionaire's wife. She was Mara Vance, the daughter of a forensic accountant, a woman who had grown up with numbers and logic, who had put that part of herself away to please a man. It was time to bring her back. Her father had taught her about money, not just how to earn it, but how it moves, how it hides, how it can be a weapon. Money is a story, Ellie, he used to say. Every transaction tells you something. Adrian's money told a story of power, of control. He had woven their finances into a complex web, with her as a dependent, a beneficiary with no real access, no real power. He had done it, he'd said, to simplify things for her. She now saw it for what it was, another bar on the cage. She went to her office, a small, sunlit room that was the one space in the penthouse that felt truly hers. She powered on her laptop. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was a steel trap. For the past year, feeling the growing distance between them, she had started paying attention. She had watched him approve wire transfers, had noted the names of his private bankers, the LLCs he used to shield his assets. She had done it out of a vague, unformed fear. Now, it was her arsenal, The first step was to understand the full scope of their finances. Adrian kept everything meticulously organized, a testament to his obsessive need for control. His arrogance was his weakness. He would never imagine her capable of untangling his web. She found the folder she was looking for, labeled Household Accounts. It was a misnomer. It contained statements for everything: his personal investment accounts, their joint checking, the holding companies for their properties. She spent the next several hours in a fugue state of concentration. The numbers on the screen were a blur of commas and zeros, but to Mara, they were starting to sing. She saw the patterns, the flow of capital. She saw the monthly payments for a lease on a high-end apartment in the Mission. Aria's apartment. She saw the credit card statements, the jewelry stores, the five-star hotels in cities she had never visited with him. The story the money told was more damning than any text message. The pain was a constant thrum beneath the surface, but the anger was a clean, sharp focus. He had not just betrayed her. He had used their shared resources to fund his double life. He had used the money she was entitled to as a wife, as a partner, to woo his mistress. The injustice of it was a fire in her veins. By midday, she had a clear picture. The bulk of their liquid assets, nearly $12 million, was held in a joint brokerage account with Morgan Stanley. It was a joint account, but Adrian was the primary account holder. He had set it up so that he had to approve any transfer over $10,000. It was his ultimate control mechanism. But there was a loophole. She was a signatory. She had the legal right to access the funds. The $10,000 limit was a setting he had put in place with their private banker, a man named Victor Langford, who revered Adrian and treated Mara with a kind of condescending politeness. To move the money, she would have to go through Victor. Or she would have to find another way. A plan began to form, audacious and terrifying. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If she failed, he would lock her out of everything, leaving her with nothing. But if she succeeded, she would be free. She looked out the window again. The city no longer looked menacing. It looked like a challenge. The gilded cage had been of her own making, in a way. She had walked in, dazzled by the gold. But a cage, no matter how beautiful, is still a prison. And she was done serving her sentence. The unveiling was complete. She had seen the truth of her life, her marriage, her husband. Now, it was time for him to see the truth of her. The plan was a delicate, dangerous dance, and Mara spent the next 2 days choreographing every step. Adrian was in his element, consumed by a new acquisition deal, which meant more late nights and a distracted, almost cavalier attitude at home. He was an absent king, confident in the security of his castle, never imagining a coup was being plotted in the Queen's chambers. His arrogance was the cloak for her operations. Her first move was to establish a new, independent financial identity. She used a VPN and a public library computer 2 neighborhoods away to open a series of new bank accounts in her maiden name, Mara Vance. She chose an online-only bank, one with robust security and no physical branches Adrian could storm into. She then opened a new brokerage account with a rival firm, one known for its discretion. The applications were a series of sterile forms and checkboxes, but for Mara, each click was a declaration of independence. She was no longer Mrs. Hale, an appendage. She was becoming herself again. The biggest hurdle remained the Morgan Stanley account, the $12 million. Going through their banker, Victor, was out of the question. He was Adrian's man. She needed to bypass him entirely. She needed to make the system work for her. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The system is just a set of rules, Ellie. You just have to know how to read them. She spent an entire night on the Morgan Stanley website, not in the user-friendly portal, but in the dense, jargon-filled sections detailing terms of service and transfer protocols. And there, buried in a subclause of a subclause, she found it. The $10,000 transfer limit was an internal flag, a courtesy notification system, not a hard legal block. As a joint account holder, she had the legal authority to move any amount of money she wished. The system was designed to allow it, but the human element, the banker, was designed to stop it. The key was to initiate a transfer so large and so fast that the system would process it automatically before any human could intervene. An electronic transfer, an ACH pull initiated from her new brokerage account, not a push from Morgan Stanley. It was a loophole, a digital seam in Adrian's armor. But it was a high-risk maneuver. A transfer of that size would undoubtedly trigger fraud alerts. She would have one shot, a small window of time before the alarms went off and the digital doors slammed shut. The perfect time would be late at night, after midnight on a Friday, to be precise. The weekend would slow any human response from the bank, and she needed Adrian to be out of the house, deeply, irretrievably out of the house. On Friday afternoon, he called her. "Bad news, love," he said, his voice slick with false regret. "The deal is hitting a snag. It's going to be an all-nighter with the lawyers. I probably won't be home until morning." Mara felt a chill run down her spine. She knew where he would be. She had seen the hotel reservation in his email, a confirmation for a suite at the Four Seasons, with Aria. The confirmation even included a request for a bottle of champagne and roses to be in the room upon arrival. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath, but solidified her resolve into something diamond-hard. "Oh no, darling," she said, her voice a perfect symphony of wifely concern. "Don't work too hard. I'll leave a plate for you in the fridge." "You're the best, Mara," he said, and hung up. That night, the penthouse was a tomb. The silence was absolute. Mara sat at her desk, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating her face. It was 1:55 a.m. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, slick with sweat. This was it. The culmination of her pain, her anger, her planning. She took a deep breath, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "For us," she whispered. At exactly 2:00 a.m., she began the sequence. She logged into her new brokerage account. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a flurry of practiced keystrokes. She navigated to the fund account page. She entered the Morgan Stanley account number and routing number, which she had long since memorized. Then came the moment of truth. The box was labeled transfer amount. She typed $11,950,000. She left $50,000 in the account, enough to avoid completely draining it, which might trigger an immediate freeze, but a small enough amount to be an insult. A tip for his troubles. Her finger hovered over the submit button. Every doubt, every fear screamed at her. The life of comfort and security. The man she had once loved. The shame of failure. She squeezed her eyes shut and saw Aria's face, laughing, wearing her necklace. She saw Adrian's dismissive smile. She saw her own pale, defeated reflection. She clicked the button. The screen refreshed. A small green check mark appeared next to the words, "Your transfer has been initiated. Funds will be available in 1 to 3 business days." It was done. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the desk. She had done it. She had fired the shot. Now she just had to wait for the sound of the explosion. She didn't stop there. The symphony was not yet complete. She moved to the next phase of her plan. Erasing herself. She logged into their joint checking account and paid off her credit cards. Then, using a bill pay feature, she scheduled a series of payments to various charities, Doctors Without Borders, the local animal shelter, a women's crisis center. She emptied the account, leaving a zero balance. A final, charitable middle finger. She packed a single suitcase. Not the designer luggage Adrian had bought her, but an old, scuffed suitcase from her college days. She packed practical clothes, a few sentimental items, a worn copy of a book her mother had given her, a small framed photo of her parents, and the ultrasound picture from her first secret doctor's appointment. She left the designer clothes in the closet, the jewelry in the velvet-lined drawers. She left the Warhols on the walls and the baccarat crystal in the cabinets. She was taking only two things of value, her future and the $12 million that would fund it. As she walked through the silent penthouse for the last time, she felt a strange sense of peace. The gilded cage was beautiful, but she was finally, blessedly, free. She left her wedding ring on the bedside table, next to the spot where Adrian's head would have been. She didn't leave a note. The bank statements would be note enough. She closed the door to the penthouse behind her, without a sound, stepping out into the cool, pre-dawn air of the city. The symphony of keystrokes was over. The silence that followed was the sound of her new life beginning. Adrian woke up on Saturday morning to the unfamiliar feeling of contentment. The hotel suite was drenched in sunlight, the sheets were soft, and Aria was a warm, tangled mess of limbs beside him. The deal he'd been working on had closed late last night. The real one, not the fictional one he'd told Mara about. And the celebration with Aria had been exactly the release he'd needed. He felt powerful, invincible. The king of his many castles. He checked his phone, a habit ingrained in his DNA. A few congratulatory emails from his board, a market alert. Nothing from Mara. That was good. It meant she was settled, quiet, respecting his space. He smiled. He had it all, and he managed it perfectly. He kissed Aria's sleeping shoulder, showered, and ordered room service. It was nearly noon when he finally drove his Porsche out of the hotel garage, the city of San Francisco gleaming under a perfect blue sky. He decided to be a good husband. He'd stop and pick up Mara's favorite pastries, a small gesture to smooth over his night away. A token of his affection. When he walked into the penthouse, the silence struck him as odd. It was deeper than usual. "Mara," he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. No answer. He walked into the kitchen. No plate in the fridge. A flicker of annoyance. She was usually so thoughtful. He went to their bedroom. The bed was perfectly made, which was strange. Mara always left it unmade until the housekeeper came. And then he saw it. Sitting on his bedside table, stark and gleaming against the dark wood, was her wedding ring. Next to it, her engagement ring. A cold dread, foreign and unwelcome, began to creep up his spine. This was not Mara. This was a statement. He called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail! His annoyance curdled into anger. What was this? Some kind of passive-aggressive game? He had been working his arse off, and this was the thanks he got? He stormed into her office, expecting to find her there, waiting for a confrontation. The room was empty. Her laptop was gone. He stalked back to the living room, his mind racing. He would fix this. He would call her mother, her friends, the few she had left. He would find her and end this childish drama. He pulled out his phone to check their joint account, a sudden, paranoid thought striking him. Maybe she'd bought an expensive plane ticket, run off to a spa to teach him a lesson. He logged into the Morgan Stanley app, his thumbprint, his key to the kingdom. The main portfolio page loaded. He stared at the screen, his brain refusing to process the numbers. Total account value, 50,000 dasasast. He blinked, refreshed the page. The number remained, a stark, brutal insult. $50,000. It was impossible. It was a glitch, a system error. $12 million didn't just vanish. His hands shaking, he navigated to the activity tab. And there it was, a single transaction, dated Friday, 2:03 a.m. H withdrawal, 11.9 to 50,000 torus. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from his lungs. It felt like he had been physically struck, a blow to the gut that left him gasping. No, it couldn't be. Mara? Quiet, gentle, compliant Mara. The woman who asked him for help with the TV remote? She couldn't have done this. She wouldn't know how. His mind, usually so sharp and decisive, was a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. He stumbled to his desk, his legs unsteady. He pulled up their joint checking account. 0 balance. He scrolled through the activity. Payments to charities. Her credit cards paid in full. It was a systematic, calculated demolition of their financial life. The reckoning had arrived. The phone rang, shrill and piercing in the silent apartment. It was Victor Langford, his voice tight with panic. "Adrian, I just got a high-value alert from the automated system. I've been trying to reach you all weekend. There's been a massive withdrawal from your account. I thought it had to be fraud, but... Adrian, the transfer was initiated by Mara. It was an ACH pull. It's all legal. There's nothing we can do to reverse it." The words hit him like bullets. Initiated by Mara, all legal. Nothing we can do. He hung up the phone without a word. The full scale of the catastrophe began to dawn on him. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a game. This was an execution. She had planned this. She had waited. She had gutted him with a surgeon's precision, using the very system he had built to control her. He sank into his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He looked around the penthouse, at the art he had bought, the furniture he had chosen. It all looked like a movie set for a life that was no longer his. The gilded cage was his, and he was the one trapped inside it. He was a millionaire without his millions, a king without his kingdom. The rage came next, a hot, blinding wave. The audacity, the betrayal. He had given her everything. He had built this world for her. And she had torn it down, leaving him in the rubble. He swept his arm across his desk, sending a laptop and a stack of papers crashing to the floor. He let out a roar of pure, primal fury that echoed off the cold, indifferent glass of the windows. But as the rage subsided, something else took its place. Something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Fear. It was a cold, terrifying fear that had nothing to do with the money. He had lost money before. He could make more. This was different. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted. He had looked at Mara for 5 years and had never truly seen her. He had seen a reflection of his own success, a beautiful, passive object. He had never seen the woman with a mind like a steel trap and a will of iron. The silence of the penthouse pressed in on him. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone. The architect of deception stood in the ruins of his own design, the carefully constructed compartments of his life blown wide open. There was no one to call, no deal to be made, no one to blame but the man in the mirror. The reckoning was not just financial. It was existential. Adrian Hale, the man who had everything, had just realized he had nothing at all. The fog in Carmel by the Sea was a living thing. It rolled in from the Pacific each morning, blanketing the fairy tale cottages and winding streets in a soft grey embrace. To some it was gloomy. To Mara it was a sanctuary. It was a veil, hiding her from the world she had left behind, giving her the quiet space she needed to breathe. She had rented a small cottage, tucked away on a street lined with cypress trees. It was the antithesis of the San Francisco penthouse. It was cozy, a little worn around the edges, with a stone fireplace and a small, overgrown garden. It smelled of sea salt and wood smoke. It smelled like home. The first few weeks were a blur of disorientation. Freedom, she discovered, was terrifying. For 5 years, her days had been structured by Adrian's schedule, her choices dictated by his preferences. Now, the hours stretched before her, vast and empty. She would wake up in the small, sunlit bedroom and for a moment forget where she was. The silence was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of the penthouse. It was a gentle, peaceful quiet. But it was a quiet she had to learn to fill on her own. She had money, more than she could have ever imagined. The $12 million sat in her new brokerage account, a formidable, intimidating number. It was her security, her power, but it was also a constant reminder of the life she had destroyed to get it. She felt no guilt about taking it. She considered it severance pay for a job that had cost her soul. But the sheer weight of it was a responsibility she had never known. Her pregnancy was her anchor. The morning sickness was a constant, physical reminder of the new life growing inside her. It was a life that was hers alone. This child would not be a Hale. It would be a Vance. It would be raised not in a sterile museum of a home, but in a place with a garden near the sea. This child would know a different kind of life, a different kind of strength. She began to build a routine. She would walk on the beach every morning, the cold sand a shock to her bare feet, the roar of the ocean a cleansing sound. She would spend hours in the local bookstore, rediscovering her love for words. She bought a canvas and a set of paints, and for the first time in years, she painted for herself. Not for a collection, not for an investment, but for the sheer joy of creation. Her first painting was a swirl of angry reds and blacks, a chaotic mess of emotion. But as the days turned into weeks, the colors began to soften. Blues and greens and yellows began to appear on the canvas. She made her first friend. Her name was Maria, the owner of the local bakery where Mara bought her bread each morning. Maria was a warm, earthy woman in her 50s, with flour on her apron and kindness in her eyes. She asked no questions about Mara's past. She simply accepted her as she was, the quiet, pregnant woman who seemed to be running from something. "You have sad eyes," Maria said one morning, handing Mara a warm croissant. "But they are getting less sad every day." Mara had smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think you're right." She knew Adrian would be looking for her. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. She had covered her tracks well, using her maiden name, paying for everything in cash for the first month. But Adrian was a hunter. It was only a matter of time. She rehearsed what she would say, what she would do. She would be calm, strong, unmovable. She would not let him drag her back into his world. One afternoon, sitting in her garden, she felt the baby kick for the first time. A tiny, definitive flutter from within. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of pain or anger. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. In that small, quiet garden, surrounded by the gentle fog of Carmel, Mara felt a profound sense of connection, not to a man or a past life, but to the future she was creating, kick by tiny kick. She was no longer just running from something. She was building something, a life, a home, a self. The money was the foundation, but the structure was being built with her own 2 hands. She was learning to be alone, but she was not lonely. She was learning to be her own provider, her own protector. The new dawn in Carmel was not a brilliant, fiery sunrise. It was a slow, gentle lightening of the sky. It was the fog beginning to lift, revealing the promise of a clear day. Mara was still healing. The scars of Adrian's betrayal were deep. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a sense of hope that was not tied to a man or a dream of a perfect life. It was a quiet, steady hope, born of her own resilience. It was the hope of a survivor. The knock on the door came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a crisp, clear day in Carmel, the kind where the sky is a brilliant, cloudless blue and the ocean glitters like a field of diamonds. Mara was in the kitchen, her hands covered in dough, her belly a round, firm globe beneath her apron. She was 7 months pregnant now, and had finally settled into a rhythm that felt like peace. The knock was firm, confident. Not the gentle tap of the mailman or the cheerful rap of Maria from the bakery. A cold dread, a ghost of her past life, washed over her. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who was on the other side of that door. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. She walked to the door, her steps heavy. She looked through the peephole, and the breath caught in her throat. It was Adrian. He looked different. The arrogant, invincible predator was gone. The man standing on her doorstep looked diminished. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was gaunt, and there were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. She took a deep breath, her hand resting protectively on her belly. She had prepared for this moment. She would be strong. She opened the door. He didn't speak for a long moment. His eyes, which had always been so sharp and assessing, were now filled with a bewildered, aching sadness. He looked at her. Then his gaze dropped to her swollen stomach, and a look of such profound, gut-wrenching pain crossed his face that she almost felt a flicker of pity. Almost. "Mara," he finally said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "Adrian," she replied, her own voice cool and steady, a perfect mask for the turmoil inside her. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy," he said, a ghost of his old, proud smile touching his lips. "You were very thorough. But I have resources." He paused. "I hired a private investigator, a very expensive one." The implication hung in the air between them. He no longer had the millions to throw at a problem. He was bleeding money, and finding her was what he had chosen to spend it on. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone flat. "To talk," he said, his eyes pleading. "Please, just 5 minutes." She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door in his face. But then she looked at him again, at the broken man standing where the Titan used to be. Curiosity, and perhaps a need for her own closure, won out. "Fine," she said, stepping back to let him in. 5 minutes. He walked into her small cottage, his large frame seeming to shrink in the cozy space. He looked around, at the simple furniture, the half-finished painting on the easel, the stack of baby books on the coffee table. It was a world away from the life he knew. A life he had built. "You did all this," he said, his voice a whisper of awe and disbelief. "You took the money and you just disappeared." "I didn't disappear, Adrian," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I escaped. There's a difference." He finally met her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?" he asked, the question raw with hurt. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "When would have been a good time? Before or after your bored dinner with Aria? Should I have left a note next to the empty bank account confirmation?" He flinched as if she had struck him. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I failed you. I failed us. I was a fool, Mara. An arrogant, selfish fool." He looked so utterly defeated, so completely stripped of his usual armor, that Mara found herself at a loss for words. This was not the confrontation she had imagined. She had expected rage, threats, demands. She had not expected this raw, broken confession. "I lost everything," he continued, sinking onto the edge of her armchair, his head in his hands. "The company is in turmoil. The board is questioning my leadership. I had to sell the penthouse, the art, everything. But that's not what I lost. I lost you. And I lost." His voice broke, and he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. The ghost of their past was in the room with them, a tangible presence. "I didn't do it to destroy you, Adrian," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I did it to save myself, and to save my child. I couldn't bring a baby into that life, into that world of lies." He looked up, his eyes wet with unshed tears. Is it mine?" The question was a knife to her heart, but she understood why he had to ask. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's a boy." He let out a shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half sigh. "A son," he whispered. The 5 minutes were long up. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of love and pain and betrayal. But the anger that had fueled Mara for so long had begun to dissipate, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. "You should go," she said. He stood up, his movements slow, like an old man. Can I see him? When he's born?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't want anything. I won't ask for anything. I want to see my son." Mara looked at the man before her, the ghost of her past, the father of her child. She thought of the baby growing inside her, a boy who deserved to know his father, not as a monster, but as a flawed, broken man who was capable of regret. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time, Adrian. You can't just walk back into my life. You have to earn it." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll wait." He turned and walked out the door, closing it gently behind him. Mara stood in the middle of her small, quiet living room, her hand on her belly. The confrontation was over. The ghost had been faced. And in the quiet aftermath, she realized that this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new, more complicated chapter. The chapter of forgiveness. 6 months later, the Carmel fog had given way to the brilliant, sharp light of a California winter. Mara's cottage was no longer a quiet sanctuary for one. It was a chaotic, joyful mess of baby swings, diaper bags, and the sweet, milky scent of a newborn. Noah Layton was 3 months old. He was a beautiful baby, with Mara's calm eyes and a stubborn tuft of dark hair that was all Adrian. He was the center of her universe, the sun around which her new life revolved. Motherhood was harder and more wonderful than she could have ever imagined. It was sleepless nights and endless worry, but it was also a love so fierce and profound it rearranged her soul. Adrian had kept his word. He had waited. He hadn't called. He hadn't shown up unannounced. Instead, he wrote letters. Old-fashioned, handwritten letters sent to a P.O. box she had set up. The first one had arrived a week after Noah was born. It was short, just a few lines. "I heard from a friend of a friend that you had the baby," he wrote. "I hope you are both healthy and well. I am thinking of you." The letters continued to arrive once a week. They were not letters of apology or excuse. They were letters of self-reflection. He wrote about his new life. He had been forced to step down as CEO of his company. He had sold his shares to avoid a hostile takeover. He was no longer a millionaire. He was living in a small apartment in Oakland, working as a consultant for a small tech firm. He wrote about his therapy, about the painful process of dismantling the ego he had spent his life building. He wrote about his loneliness, not for the power or the money, but for the simple, human connection he had thrown away. "I spent my whole life acquiring things," he wrote in one letter. "I thought that's what success was. I'm only now learning that the things that matter can't be bought." Mara read each letter, her feelings a complex mix of pity, skepticism, and a grudging respect. It was easy to be repentant when you had lost everything. But there was a sincerity in his words, a raw honesty she had never known from him. He was not trying to win her back. He was trying to find himself. When Noah was 2 months old, she had written back. A short, simple note with a single picture of their son. "This is Noah," she wrote. "He is healthy and happy." A week later, a package arrived. It wasn't an expensive gift. It was a children's book, a worn, well-loved copy of Goodnight Moon. Tucked inside was a note from Adrian. "This was my favorite book when I was a child. My mother used to read it to me every night. I thought maybe you could read it to him." And so Mara had made a decision. Today was the day. She had called him, her heart in her throat. "If you want to meet your son," she had said, "you can come to the beach." At noon, she saw him from a distance, walking along the shoreline. He was dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, looking like just another person enjoying the winter sun. He saw her and Noah sitting on a blanket near the dunes, and his steps faltered. He approached them slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching a wild, easily startled creature. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in her arms. "He's perfect," he whispered. "He is," Mara said, her voice soft. "Can I?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly. Mara hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. She carefully transferred the sleeping baby into his father's arms. Adrian held his son as if he were made of the most fragile glass. He looked down at the tiny, perfect face, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. It was not the tear of a broken man, but the tear of a man whose heart was breaking open. They sat on the beach for over an hour, not saying much. They watched the waves roll in and out, a steady, timeless rhythm. The past was there, between them, a vast ocean of hurt. But the small, sleeping child in Adrian's arms was a bridge, a fragile, hopeful bridge. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Mara," Adrian said quietly, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "I don't deserve it, but I want to be a father to him. If you'll let me, I'll do anything. I'll follow any rule you set. I don't want him to grow up without knowing me." Mara looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in a long time. She saw the man he was, and the man he was trying to become. The price of his redemption had been everything he thought he valued. The price of her freedom had been her innocence. They were two broken people, bound together by the new, innocent life they had created. "Okay, Adrian," she said, the word tasting strange and new on her tongue. "Okay, we can start there." It was not a promise of a future together. The trust, the love she had once had for him, was gone forever. But it was a promise of something else, a promise of grace, a promise that the cycle of pain could end with them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, Adrian handed Noah back to her. Their fingers brushed, a brief, fleeting touch. It was not the touch of a husband and wife, or of lovers. It was the touch of two survivors, two parents, who had found their way to a fragile, uncertain peace. The story of their marriage was over, but the story of their family, in a new and unexpected form, was just beginning. Redemption was not a destination. It was a journey, and they were finally, tentatively, taking the first steps. That was the story of Mara, Adrian, and the price of betrayal. A story that shows us that sometimes hitting rock bottom is the only way to find a new foundation to build upon. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about the money you have or the power you wield, but about the courage to reclaim your own life, even when it means tearing down everything you thought you knew. If this story resonated with you, if you felt Mara's pain, her anger, and her ultimate triumph, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of complex lives, emotional journeys, and the enduring power of the human spirit. What part of Mara's story surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below.